One of the most difficult parts of the Christian life is the fact that becoming a follower of Christ does not make us immune to the trials and testing of life. Today, I want to begin a new mini series entitled Trials and Testings. Now, the question is, why would a good and loving God allow us to go through things such as the death of a child, disease and injury to ourselves and our loved ones, or even suffering financial hardships or worry and fear? I mean, if he really loves us, wouldn't he take all these things away from us? After all, doesn't loving us mean he wants our lives to be easy and comfortable? Well, the answer is no, it doesn't. The Bible clearly teaches that God loves us as his children, and he works all things together for our good, even in the trials and testings we experience, according to Romans 8:28. Now, in applying that to our lives, that means then that the trials and testing he allows in our lives are part of his working all things together for our good. So for a Christian, all the trials and testings we experience have a divine purpose, a divine reason in God developing and strengthening our faith. Because God's ultimate purpose for you and for me, for all of us, is to grow more and more into the image of his Son. In other words, that we become like Jesus in our lives, according to Romans 8:29. So you see, this is God's goal for the Christian. And everything in life, including our trials and testings, are designed to enable us to reach that goal. It's part of the process of God sanctifying us or setting us apart for his purposes and teaching us how to live in order to please him. Now today, I want us to look at Genesis 22. And in Genesis chapter 22, we see the story of Abraham when he was faced with the severest test imaginable. I want you to listen as I read beginning in verse 1. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham?" "Here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about." God says to him, "Abraham, I want you to take your only son Isaac, whom I know you dearly love, and not just your son, but your only son whom you really, really love. And I want you to offer him as a burnt offering." Now, I mean, that is absolutely incredible. God is saying, "Abraham, I want a sacrifice out of you, and I want it to be a human sacrifice. I want your son, and I want you to kill him as an offering to me." Now, what's so interesting about this is that this was actually a pagan practice. It was a thing that pagans, unbelievers did in their false worship. You see, no believer would ever offer his own child as a human sacrifice to God. And furthermore, this was the son that God had promised to Abraham and Sarah. You'll remember that not only was Sarah barren and unable to have children, but both she and Abraham were well beyond childbearing years. So, why then would God call for human sacrifice when he had never called for a human sacrifice ever before? And for God to do that would be the absolute opposite of everything that Abraham knew to be true about God. So, why would God go to such great lengths to enable a man and a woman nearing 100 years of age who had been barren all of their lives to produce a son and then ask that they kill that son? Why would God make a promise to Abraham that he would be the father of many nations and that his descendants would be as the sands of the sea and the stars of heaven, and then kill the only child who that promise would come through that he had given him in his old age? I mean, the whole idea was absolutely bizarre. It was absurd, because all hope of this promise that God had made being fulfilled through his son Isaac would literally die with him. And what makes it even more severe is just not that Isaac was to die, but that Abraham, his very own father, was to be the one to kill him, to sacrifice him. I mean, it's absolutely incredible when you think about it. It's one thing to have the one you love die, but it's a whole nother level when you're told that you're to be the one to kill that person. I mean, it's unthinkable, really. And we would have understood if Abraham had responded and said, "Look, God, can you please explain this to me? This makes absolutely zero sense. There is no sense that I can make out of this. I just can't do this." But instead, I want us to notice his response. Listen as I read verse 3. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. Now, I want you to notice here that instead of questioning God, Abraham gets up early in the morning, he gets ready to leave, and he actually goes and cuts the wood. He even had to cut his own wood to put his son on to burn him as a sacrifice to God. And it says he rose up and he went to the place where God had told him or instructed him the sacrifice was to take place. Now, what an amazing man. I mean, Abraham is absolutely an amazing man. No questioning, no delay, no argument, no dispute, no reaction, just simple obedience. 3 days later, we read this in verses 4 and 5. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Now here's the secret, if you caught it, and you need to keep this in mind. Abraham says to the servant, "We will go and worship," and then notice, "then we will both come back. Look at verse 6. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac. And he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the two of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father, Abraham, "Father?" "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the two of them went on together. Now, I find this absolutely gut-wrenching. A trusting son who doesn't know what's going on or what's going to happen, and he says to his dad, he says to his father, about this act of worship, "Where's the lamb?" And Abraham responds and says, "My son, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering." You see, I think that deep down in Abraham's heart, he knew that God had a plan that was consistent with God's character and consistent with God's covenant promise to him. I don't know that he knew what that plan actually was, but I think he had a good idea. Now listen to verse 9. When they had reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. We're told that when they came to the place God had told him, Abraham built the altar there, he laid the wood in order, and then he bound Isaac. He literally tied up his son. Now, notice here that the scripture records that there was no struggle on Isaac's part. He tied him up, and Abraham laid him on the altar, and then he took the knife and he lifted it up to kill his son. That is unbelievable. Do you understand by reading this story what it means when it says Abraham believed God and it was counted to him as righteousness? Do you understand why the New Testament says that Abraham is the father of the faithful? He is the greatest single model of trust in God that the Bible knows anything about apart from Jesus Christ himself. And the man, this father, is at the point of plunging the knife into the very body of the son that he loves so dearly. It's an unthinkable thing, really. I mean, what a trial, what a test. It's contradictory, indescribably painful for Abraham. It's murderous, really. It's inconsistent with everything that Abraham knew about God, and yet he is submissive, he is obedient, and he is going to worship God no matter what the cost is, even if it means taking the life of his one and only son that God had promised him, that he loves so dearly with all his heart. And so we're told that God took Abraham's action of being willing to sacrifice his own son as an act of obedience. God judged Abraham on his willingness to obey, and he didn't make him carry out the actual act of slaying his son and sacrificing him. Verse 11 tells us this. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. You see, this was a test. And did Abraham pass it? You bet he did. He passed with flying colors. Why? Because he was willing to obey God no matter what. And so God says, you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Now, what this example of Abraham shows us is that we might be tested in things in our own lives that are very dear to us. We might be tested in things very dear to us, like a son or a daughter or a husband, a wife, a friend. We may have to offer up our own Isaac, to give the ones we love most over to the Lord, not only in death, but maybe even in life. You say, what do you mean? Well, maybe by letting them go the way that God wants them to go, and not necessarily the way that we want them to go. You see, when Abraham was willing to give up Isaac, no matter how much Isaac meant to him, he showed God that he wasn't possessive, but that he would release Isaac to God's will, even in death. Why? Because he was willing, and he would do anything that God asked him to do. Now, we all have a lot of trials in life, don't we? But I can't ever imagine a trial like that, or a test. I can't imagine what I would do if God told me to do that. I can't even begin to think what I would go through in my life if God asked me to do what he asked Abraham to do with Isaac. But I think that we can conclude from this that the more difficult the obedience, the more excellent the obedience is. And the more difficult the obedience, the more self-denial there is in it. So here we have an obedience that takes tremendous self-denial and is therefore the most excellent example of obedience. Abraham passed the test. God says, now I know that you fear me. In other words, you truly follow me. Abraham, whatever the cost, I know you will follow me. I mean, what a trial. What a test that Abraham went through. The commentary on this trial of Abraham is also found in the New Testament. It's given in the 11th chapter of Hebrews, the chapter that's called the Hall of Fame of biblical characters. And in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 17, how did Abraham do this? How could he bring himself to do this? Well, we're told. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 17 tells us very clearly how he could do it. In the first two words of verse 17, it tells the whole story. By what? By faith. Abraham, when God tested him. You see, this was a test. God was saying, this is a test. And then when he was tested, when Abraham offered Isaac as a sacrifice, he who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, it says, even though God had said to him, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. How could he do that? Here it comes, verse 19 of Hebrews 11. Abraham reasoned. It means he recognized the fact that God could even raise the dead, and so, in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. You know why he was willing to do that? Because he believed by faith that God could raise the dead. Had Abraham ever seen the dead raised before? Not that we're told. But he believed in this moment and in this trial and in this test where God was calling him to sacrifice his son, that even if he was told to go through with it and literally take Isaac's life, he believed that God could raise the dead and that he would literally raise Isaac back from the dead. You see, what he really believed was this, that God was so true to his word that if he made a promise to Abraham, that through Isaac, Abraham would be blessed, and that his offspring would be as the sand of the sea. He knew that God would even raise the dead, raise Isaac, to keep that promise that he had made to Abraham. That is tremendous faith. That is absolutely tremendous faith on his part. I wonder if Abraham was a little disappointed when he wasn't allowed to take his son's life, because he would like to have seen or witnessed a resurrection. Now, we don't know that for a fact, but regardless, he believed that God would raise Isaac from the dead. Now, what does that tell us? What does that tell you and me? Well, it tells us that a person can go through the severest imaginable trial of life if he trusts God, if he really trusts God. And if he believes that God is on the throne, that God will keep his promises, that God never makes mistakes, that God always fulfills his word, and that God will accomplish his purposes. You see, that's the kind of faith that passes the test. And when Abraham was put through that test, when he was tried or tested, he passed it with absolutely flying colors. Is it any wonder that this man is the single greatest human model of faith that we can look to? In Galatians chapter 3, verse 7, it says, "Know ye therefore that they who are of faith are the sons of Abraham." You see, anybody who lives by faith in God is in a spiritual sense a son of Abraham. He is the father of the faithful, that is Abraham. He is the model of faith and the father of the faithful. And if we have faith in God, then we are in a spiritual sense his son. Verse 9 of Galatians 3 says, "They who are of faith are blessed with faithful Abraham." You see, he knew that through him, God said the nations of the world would be blessed, and that God would keep his word and bring it to pass. Now we have to realize that God is going to allow us to go through tests. And the thing that sustains us in the midst of that is our trust in God, our faith that God is working all things out for his own holy purpose in and through our lives, through these trials and these tests. I know we dream of worldly ease, and we like to create a perfect environment. We want to have absolute comfort in our lives. We want to get through all of the rough spots, literally get all of those rough spots out of our lives. We want to make sure everything is perfectly settled. And honestly, I have never experienced such a moment in my life. Every once in a while, I think that I'm getting there, and then I find out I'm not really there. But the fact that we have temporary rest and temporary ease at times in our lives sort of fools us into thinking that we might find a permanent exemption from testing and trial. But that's not the case. Do you remember the words of the psalmist in Psalm 30, verse 6, when he said, In my prosperity, I said, I shall never be moved. Now, what he's implying there is this, that in that statement, I was wrong. I thought I'd have all this, but I was wrong. When I was comfortable, I thought it would always be like this. And you see, you can live in a fool's paradise if you want, never forecasting any trouble, promising yourself ease, but that isn't what Jesus said about life. In fact, he said this in John chapter 16, verse 33. I have told you these things, Jesus said, so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take part, or rather take heart, for I have overcome the world. Psalm 23 says, Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. You see, my friends, trials will come. They're inevitable. They're going to happen to every one of us. Test, tribulation, it's all coming. And if it hasn't come already, you can be expecting their visit. But our confidence in the midst of the trials and tests of life must be in the presence and the power of God to deliver us through them.